Funding for this program is provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Penitentiary punishment, 19 years in Texas Department of Corrections.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. In Florida, there were during 1983 nearly 26,000 people in prison, 14,000 in jail, 62,000 on probation, and another 6,000 people on parole. More than 100,000 people, 2% of the adult male population of the state, were under some kind of correctional supervision. But how do you supervise so many people when the prisons and jails are overcrowded and 2/3 of the convicted offenders have been left in the community? In the past, the answer was to require these offenders to report periodically to probation and parole officers. But these officers had heavy caseloads and were badly overworked. Often they could do little more than talk to a probationer or parolee by telephone once or twice a month and hope that these people were staying out of trouble. Beginning in 1983, Florida developed an alternative, house arrest. By the end of 1986, more than 14,000 offenders had been confined, not in jails or prisons, but in their own homes. One of the state's largest such programs is in Fort Lauderdale.
Well, being on house arrest gives me a chance to stay home, take care of my obligations to my family, and keep me out of jail. It calls me a couple times on the weekends at 1:30 in the morning, and normally I'm half asleep. I don't even know what I'm saying. I'm running down to my steps and tripping over the cat and everything, and I still don't make it sometimes. But, you know, there's like so many things that bother you about it, but you have to deal with it and try to, you know, get over it and live your life after you get through this program.
Offenders on the house arrest program, or community control as they call it here, follow strict rules. They are confined to home except for work, medical appointments, important errands, and community service projects. 8 out of 10 work at regular jobs. Many pay restitution to their victims. About half do community service work. All are closely tracked by community control officers.
Hello.
Hello. This is an intensive supervision officer calling to confirm that the person under our curfew regulations is at home.
Of the 800 offenders on the program in Fort Lauderdale, about 1/3 are monitored by additional computerized robot telephone calls.
At the tone, please confirm receipt of this message by stating your name and the time.
We have approximately 300 people on it right now. And what it does is it calls the numbers that you programmed into it in between the hours that you've set for it. So say you set the hours at between 5:30 and 12 o'clock at night, it'll go down and call all 300 people right in a row. And then if there's any time left after that's done, it'll start on the beginning of the list.
Among this group monitored by the telephone robot, a dozen also wear an electronic device on their wrist or ankle. It automatically verifies the offender's identity to the computer.
The person has to wear a wristlet, and when the machine calls them, they have to insert this into a box that's attached to their phone. In that way, we know for sure it's them since they can't take the wristlet off, and we can program that according to what times we want them called, specific times, 5:30, 9 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning to make sure they haven't disappeared anywhere.
We just had a new wristlet case assigned this morning.
Community control officers supervise 20 offenders each, in comparison to 4 times that number for probation officers. They have at least 7 contacts per week with each offender, about half in person.
This case was placed on the wristlet program. It's been assigned to Bernard Roberson.
The computerized robot phone call, with or without wristlet, is a supplement to the officer's field work.
It doesn't take the place of the officer. The officer is still expected to be out there in the field, making their contacts, checking on this person at their employment site, at their home, but it assists them in stepping up to supervision and randomly calling these individuals more often than they would physically be able to do themselves.
You know, some officers, no matter how much they try, are going to fall into a pattern. They end up, you know, seeing the person the same night, or they end up calling them the same night, around the same time, or whatever. And the machine doesn't do that.
All of the robot computer calls are recorded on tape and shown on a computer printout. If the call has not been successfully completed, the officer listens to the tape to verify the voice. The wristlet, on the other hand, makes this identification automatically.
We have had occasions in the past where the guy's brother picks up the phone for him and goes, "Yeah, this is me, I'm here," you know. So you got to be careful, and they can't do that with the wristlet either.
Regardless of how offenders are monitored, the Community Control Program provides a middle ground between probation and prison, a sentencing alternative. In Florida, judges can sentence nonviolent felons, as well as persons who have committed misdemeanors, to this program. Judge Leroy Moe decided that the offender we talked with would have to wear the wristlet after he violated both his original probation for indecent exposure and then the terms of a house arrest sentence.
Well, I could have sent him to state prison, but I didn't think that was appropriate under the circumstances. He wasn't a real danger as far as violence was concerned. And probation obviously didn't work, so I picked house arrest as pretty much the middle ground.
The house arrest programs are cheaper for communities. State officials say it costs less than $3 a day to keep an offender on house arrest, about 1/10 the cost of a day in state prison.
I think that it serves two purposes. I mean, naturally, the first one is that the prisons are overcrowded, but I think that we are saving money and we are doing something in a positive effort to help this individual to not only punish them and for them to realize that this is a deterrent, but we're also helping people become disciplined for the first time in their life, to have some structure in their life that probation doesn't really afford them, nor would prison. And we're giving them new rules to live by in the community. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's very popular.
It's better. I can't say anything bad about it. I mean, like you said, it's better than being in jail. Something I can stress, because I was there.
Here to discuss these matters are Leonard Flynn, Director of the Probation and Parole Program of the Department of Corrections of the state of Florida, Alvin Bronstein, Director of the National Prison Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, and Joan Petersilia, Senior Researcher at the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, California. Mr. Flynn, how many people are currently under house arrest in your state?
Currently we have 5,576.
How are these people selected? What determination goes into putting you on house arrest?
Anybody except capital offense can be placed in the program. The target group are the nonviolent property offenders. However.
But there are some people who have been convicted of a violent offense in
Yes.
the program, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, who makes this determination, the judge or
The
your
judge
department?
makes the final decision. Of course, the probation officer, community control officer, makes a recommendation in the pre-sentence investigations in many situations, but the judge is the final authority.
Are there any statutory guidelines that determine who gets in and who does not in, other than eliminating capital offenders?
No.
I see. Has this house arrest program, in fact, helped reduce the prison population in the state?
During the first year of operation in 1983-84, the commitments to prison dropped by an average of 180 per month when compared to the previous year. And no time in recent history has the commitments to prison in Florida dropped. Sentencing guidelines also went into effect at the same time and probably had some effect, but we account most of that drop to community control program.
How do the people in Florida feel about seeing convicted felons, some of whom have committed a violent crime, sentenced to their homes instead of prison?
We've had good support from the public, the general public, because the offenders have to pay restitution to the victims of crime, and of course they have to pay to the state $30 per month to help offset the cost of supervision, and they support their dependents and families because they have to work. The law enforcement community sees this program as a punishment program, building accountability and responsibility, and they've been very supportive.
What about the victims of these crimes? Do any victims complain that these people aren't being treated sufficiently harshly?
We've had very few victims that have complained, again, because they get reimbursement for the cost of the crime, the loss of their property, or whatever the case might be.
Now, what are the conditions that these people must observe when they're on house arrest? Do they have to get a job? Do they have to attend certain programs? What does it work?
Community controlees are confined to the residence. They serve their prison sentence in their own house. They must work at regular employment. They have to perform 150 to 200 hours of public service work. They have to repay the victim of the crime restitution, reparation or restitution to society in the form of the public service work. They have to pay cost of supervision fees to the state of Florida to help offset the cost of the program. They have to fill out daily logs reflecting their activity. It's a punishment-oriented program designed to instill responsibility and accountability as a foundation prior to self-improvement programs.
How many people on house arrest commit, to the best of your knowledge, crimes while under house arrest?
We've had a little 2,537 offenders that have been revoked. About 1,500 or 60% of them because of technical violations, meaning that they weren't home when they were supposed to be, or weren't at the job when they were supposed to be, or didn't pay victim restitution. And the remaining 900 committed either a new misdemeanor offense or a new felony offense and were sent to prison.
Now, when they conditions of probation are revoked, does that mean that they automatically go to prison?
When the conditions of community control are revoked, just about all circumstances they go to prison, yes.
And what proportion of all the people who have gone through the program is this 2,500 or so who've had revocation?
It's about 17%. Over 14,000 have gone through the program or are still in it.
Let's talk about the electronic surveillance aspect of this program. What do you do if the person under community control doesn't have a telephone?
If he doesn't have a telephone, of course, we double up the personal contacts by the community control officer, and we're also using some pagers that we assign to the community controlees that do not have telephones.
Is there a problem with false alarms? Either the person is there but the system doesn't pick it up, or the person isn't there and he thinks it is?
Basically, the only bugs we've had in the electronic system is initially when we implemented the telephone robots, why the robot called an individual 13 times one night. And of course that worked out good for us because many of the other offenders around the state thought we had that kind of capability, which we didn't have. But that's about the only real problem we've run into as far as the electronic devices.
I'm sure many people watching this program want to know how the people who are wearing these wristlets or anklets that are fixed in a way that they can't remove, how they take a bath.
They can take a bath with the wristlet on. In fact, they have to. It's waterproof. They're tamper resistant, and they can do anything they normally do with the wristlet or the anklets on.
Now, what proportion of the people on house arrest are also under electronic surveillance?
The electronic devices of all kinds around the state, probably approximately 1,000 to 1,200.
All right. Let me turn to Joan Petersilia from the RAND Corporation. Mrs. Petersilia has been doing a research on this program from a national perspective. How many states have attempted to use a house arrest program?
Currently, about 10 states are using house arrest, and about another 20 are considering implementing the program in the next year.
As you listen to Mr. Flynn describe the advantages of the program, one wonders why more states don't embrace it. Do you have any theories about that?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that it's not immediately cost effective. There are some upfront costs to beefing up probation services, buying electronic devices, and so it's expensive to start out.
Can you give us some idea of what the startup cost would be?
Usually to buy 10 electronic monitoring devices costs from anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 in an upfront cost. So even though 10 states are participating, there aren't probably more than 3,000 offenders to date on electronic monitoring. So it's a relatively new and experimental program.
But you could still have house arrest without electronic monitoring.
Yes, and most of the participants of house arrest nationwide are in fact not on electronic monitoring.
Now, how many people nationwide would you guess are in house arrest with or without the surveillance?
I would say less than 10,000.
And that's out of a prison population of 500,000, a probation population of 1.5 million. Again, if you don't use electronic surveillance, the costs aren't there, at least from that. What then prevents states from embracing house arrest generally?
Well, I think it's a philosophical shift. Basically, probation has been engaged historically to provide rehabilitation, and this is making probation officers be more like police officers. And for many states, they want to protect at least some services designed to rehabilitate, and they aren't willing to abandon that historic role to programs of house arrest, which are clearly police surveillance kinds of programs.
Well, is there any fundamental incompatibility between house arrest, say staying home in the evenings on weekends, and rehabilitation, which might involve getting a job or going to school during the day? Why couldn't you have both working together?
I think you do have both, and most of the states that are experimenting with this will argue that in fact they do have both, and that keeping offenders employed, playing victim restitution, that type of thing, is in fact rehabilitative in its own right. They're simply not doing as much counseling, one-to-one counseling, as they used to.
Do we have any evidence from any state that house arrest program has an impact on recidivism, the probability that somebody will commit new crimes?
I think we have evidence that participants in house arrest are doing very well. Nationwide, less than about 15% of participants return to crime while under house arrest, and that compares to an average of about 50% for probation generally. So I think in that sense they are working, but the caution is to remember that we are selecting those people who are likely to succeed under house arrest. They're able to be employed, they usually have residents with phones, they can pay a probation supervision fee, and so all those things tend to cull out a population that would do well. And I think as the program expands, the issue of public safety and the effect on the offender's recidivism will again resurface.
Now, you said that only a small percentage commit more crimes while under house arrest. What happens to them after they leave house arrest? Do they behave the way other probationers would behave, or are they better after house arrest, or do we not know?
There's only a little evidence on that, but the evidence that does exist suggests that they do behave better, and that's primarily because they usually are able to keep their jobs that they got while under house arrest, and we know that employment and maintaining employment does reduce subsequent criminality. So the long-run effects also seem promising.
How do we think victims may feel generally about this program? Mr. Flynn said that he had a great deal of community support in Florida, but I have heard that, for example, Mothers Against Drunk Driving in some states object to people convicted of drunk driving being put on house arrest instead of being sent to prison. Is that a genuine concern or not?
I think it's starting to become a genuine concern. Most of the public are not familiar with house arrest programs, but as they're finding out that the offender that either violated, burglarized their own home is in fact now placed back in their communities, there's no assurance that these people will not commit new crimes. There's no assurance they won't simply use their homes as operations for drugs, prostitution, a number of other illicit activities. One can do them out of their homes. So I think victims, this will be a critical issue as these programs expand.
Let me ask Alvin Bronstein from the American Civil Liberties Union this question. You've heard this discussion, you've seen the tape. Do you feel there are civil liberties issues here?
Yeah, both positive and negative civil liberties issues.
Explain.
Well, we believe that in this country we're using prison too excessively. So any reduction in liberty deprivation has a positive impact on house arrest. It is a deprivation of liberty, but it's less than going to prison. So that's positive. And as long as it's not being used for people who would otherwise not go to prison, that is broadening the net. So there it's positive. On the negative side, the one that is most immediate is the one that Joan brought up. We're selecting, or there's a potential for selecting people on a race and class bias. If people don't have a phone, and people don't have the money to pay for a phone, or don't have a home or an apartment, or don't have a job, you are more likely to exclude minorities and poor people from this program and use it only for middle class or people of greater wealth.
Is there evidence that in fact this bias has appeared?
I think there is some evidence that it's being used generally for people who, as Joan said, are more likely to make it. And those people are people who are not going to be young black youth from the ghetto, but rather a middle-class white person who went off the straight and narrow once and committed some offense.
Genuine difference in the prospects for recidivism or the prospects for going straight between these two groups of offenders. Doesn't it make sense to make the program available for those people who have the best prospects for doing well in the community?
More sense to put more of your resources into ensuring that the person who has the worst prospect, and that is not a recidivator. I mean, that's the person who's going to cost society more in the long run. So put your resources into helping that person and not the person who has other resources.
What about electronic surveillance? Courts ever pronounced on the question of whether having these wristlets or anklets is consistent with the constitutional guarantees that citizens enjoy?
Only a few local court decisions which have approved them. As you know, today, people in prison and offenders generally, people on probation, have very few Fourth Amendment protections.
The Fourth Amendment refers to search and seizure.
Search and seizure, that is. They have very few search and seizure protections, if any. I don't think those present serious Fourth Amendment or search and seizure problems. I am more concerned about the potential for abuse in electronic surveillance.
Explain that concern.
Well, we have the technology, and it's already being used to follow these people in the community with the bracelets or the wristlets. We can probably have the technology to attach recording devices and transmitting devices. So we now know what butcher or grocer or bookstore the person goes to, what they're saying at the bookstore, who they're talking to and what they're saying. And suppose we then extend it into the schools or to the into employees to find out what they're doing. The Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Meese, a few weeks ago, suggested that employers begin surveillance programs of their employees in the parking lots and the bars they go to. Why not put bracelets on? We'll know what they're doing all the time.
Is there any evidence that that in fact has happened, or is that just a possibility?
No, that's a possibility. I mean, it's, you know, it's the kind of possibility that we read about many years ago in 1984, but Big Brother may be here very shortly.
Let me ask Mr. Flynn, is Big Brother around the corner in the state of Florida? Do you feel that we're on a slippery slope with these electronic devices?
No, I think we're on solid grounds. Of course, it's a lot less restrictive than if they go to prison. They have a Big Brother watching them 24 hours a day in prison when they go to the bathroom and anything else in the institution, so it's much less restrictive. Let me respond to the selection process that all types of offenses are used in the Florida program. There's no exclusion because an individual can't pay cost supervision fees or doesn't have a job or may not be successful. As a matter of fact, a couple of newspapers have said we are a little too relaxed in the selection process. All types of offenders, drug offenders, aggravated assault cases, breaking and entering cases, worthless check cases, all included in the program.
Well, let me ask you about a point that Mr. Bronstein raised. What is the racial composition of persons who are sent to prison or who are on conventional probation? What is the racial mix of people who are under house arrest?
We've not done a real scientific study, but we've done a preliminary report, and it seems to follow the pattern of people being placed on probation as well as being sent to prison.
You don't see any differences along racial lines?
At this point, we don't see a problem there.
Do you worry about this issue of net widening that he mentioned, namely that this program should be an alternative to prison, not an alternative to probation? Is this a concern of yours?
We apply the sentencing guideline score sheets, and reflects that 72% of the people placed in community-controlled house arrest are bona fide prison diversions. Now, the remaining 28%, about 14%, are probation cases that are put in there by the judges because they want closer control. And this is net widening to the extent of 14%. The other 14% are county jail diversions.
Joan, let me ask you about these two issues that have arisen. First, net widening, and secondly, whether this kind of program excludes services. First, about net widening. Do you think this program should be an alternative to prison or an alternative to probation?
I think that depends. Geographically, probation services mean different things in different places. I'm not concerned about it enhancing probation if you're talking about a place like Los Angeles. For those probationers, I want more control.
Why Los Angeles?
Well, Los Angeles, the probation officer sees his felony probation caseload about once a month. To me, as a member of the public, that doesn't seem like enough. On the other hand, in other states where you've got already tight controls on probationers, I don't want electronic monitoring applied to those people. So I think the question differs depending on what your local system looks like.
Now, you mentioned that some probation officers resist the program because they're concerned that they're no longer performing their usual function of service delivery. You've heard Mr. Flynn describe some of the services that are provided in Florida. Do you think this is enough? Do you think probation officers will be satisfied with this, or do they want to do something more? And if so, what?
I think the traditional probationer officer will not be satisfied with this. And I think what you see in some of these programs is a different method of recruiting and training. I mean, we will be spending a new kind of probation officer who is very comfortable with the monitoring function.
I see. And won't it also require some kind of reorganization of the probation system? I mean, you can't work 9 to 5 as a probation officer if what your real job is to make sure that somebody's at home at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly. It switches probation to a 24-hour operation.
And probation then becomes organized more like a police department and less like a service delivery program. Is that right?
That's right, and that's why many probation unions are fighting this kind of program.
Have these unions fought?
Reform. It's an alternative to imprisonment, and it's a prison program, closer to a prison program than a probation program. They serve the prison sentence in their house, as I previously indicated. So we don't want to mix it up with the probation. We have intensive probation in Florida too.
But that's a separate program.
Classification system for max, medium, and minimum, but that's a separate program.
Mr. Bronstein.
Yeah, but that's where the potential for real abuse lies. If they go to your budget department in Tallahassee and they say, we now have the technology to eliminate all but 3% of all probation or community control offices in the state, because we can put everything on computer and have everything monitored electronically. The budget people are going to buy that. It's going to be a lot cheaper ultimately. And then you eliminate all human contact and you have surveillance all of the time by machines, and those machines are going to know everything that that person does all of the time, and I think that's where you have the potential for serious problems.
Is there legislation that you would favor that would eliminate or reduce the possibility of that slippery slope?
Yeah, I think we could tie this into federal legislation, which already exists dealing with wiretapping and electronic monitoring. There ought to be some protections to make sure that we don't really invade privacy beyond what is necessary for community protection, because you're going to have not community protection resulting, you're just going to have people being robots.
The electronic devices in Florida are designed completely to supplement the officer, not to take his place.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for watching. For Crime File, I'm James Wilson.
Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice.